Before September 1776, the Hannons were just settlers. A father who'd carved a homestead from wilderness with his own hands. A mother who'd borne 9 children in a cabin she'd helped build. A family that lived on the edge of civilization, where the mountains met the sky and the Cherokee hunting grounds began just across the river. The land they claimed wasn't worth much by coastal standards. Rocky soil that fought every plow. Dense forests that took years to clear. A valley along the Pacolet River where morning mist hung so thick you couldn't see your neighbor's smoke, assuming you had neighbors close enough to see. Maybe 200 acres that a Charleston merchant wouldn't have paid 50 pounds for on his best day. But that land was how Thomas Hannon fed his family, how he built a future in a place that offered futures to men willing to work themselves into early graves, how he'd promised his wife Margaret a life free from the obligations and judgments of settled society. When the Cherokee raiding party crossed the river on that September morning, they thought they were reclaiming hunting grounds that treaties had stolen. They were ending a bloodline that had survived the crossing from Ulster, the brutal voyage to Carolina, the diseases and dangers that killed half the families who tried to settle this far west. This is not a story about a massacre. This is a story about what happens when two peoples claim the same ground, and only one can remain. This is about the last morning of the Hannon family, and the 3 children who survived to remember it. Prologue: The Geography of the Forgotten Frontier. Western North Carolina in the autumn of 1776 was a place that existed beyond the concern of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. While men in powdered wigs debated independence in civilized halls, families like the Hannons lived in a different America entirely, a place where survival required skills that city dwellers couldn't comprehend, where violence was as common as rain, and where the distance between life and death could be measured in seconds. The land that would become Polk County stretched across the eastern edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a region of steep ridges, narrow valleys, and rivers that ran cold and fast from peaks that touched the clouds. The Pacolet River cut through this landscape like a boundary between worlds. On the eastern bank, white settlers had begun claiming land through a combination of legal grants and simple occupation. On the western bank, the Cherokee Nation maintained hunting grounds that their people had used for centuries, maybe millennia, their claims backed not by paper but by presence and by force. The geography itself conspired to create conflict. The valleys were fertile but narrow, surrounded by mountains that made travel difficult and isolation inevitable. A family could homestead for years without seeing another white face, could raise children who spoke more to trees than to other humans, could live and die without ever appearing in any official record. The Cherokee used these same valleys for seasonal hunting camps, following game trails that predated European arrival, harvesting resources that sustained their communities through harsh winters. By 1776, the careful balance that had existed between these two peoples was collapsing. The Revolution had fractured old alliances and created new hostilities. The British had encouraged Cherokee resistance to American settlement, had provided weapons and promises of support against the colonists who threatened their lands. The Americans had responded with force, burning Cherokee towns, destroying crops, killing anyone who resisted the inexorable push westward. Thomas Hannon had arrived in this contested landscape in 1766, 10 years before the morning that would end his life. He was 30 years old then, already married to Margaret McClure, already father to 3 children, already convinced that the crowded settlements of eastern Carolina offered no future for a man without money or connections. The land grants being offered in the western territories promised opportunity to those willing to risk everything for it. The journey west had taken 3 months, traveling by wagon when roads existed, by horse when they didn't, on foot when the terrain defeated even horses. They'd passed through the Piedmont, climbed into the mountains, descended into valleys where no white man had built anything permanent. Margaret had been pregnant during the journey, had given birth to their 4th child in a hastily constructed lean-to during a thunderstorm that threatened to wash them off the mountain entirely. The baby, a girl they'd named Sarah, had died within a week, buried in ground they didn't own, marked by a cairn of stones that probably disappeared within a season. They'd chosen their land carefully. A valley that opened onto the Pacolet River, protected by ridges on 3 sides, with good water and soil that looked like it might support crops if properly worked. Thomas had built the cabin that first winter, a single-room structure made from logs chinked with mud and moss, roofed with bark that leaked in heavy rains but kept out the worst of the weather. Margaret had made it a home, had hung their few possessions from pegs driven into the walls, had created order from the chaos of frontier existence. The children came regularly as children did when birth control meant abstinence, and abstinence wasn't practical for couples living in single-room cabins. After Sarah came John in 1767, then William in 1768, Thomas Jr. in 1770, Margaret in 1772, Winnie in 1773, and finally Elizabeth in August 1776, just weeks before the mourning that would orphan her. Combined with the three older children, James, Edwin, and Martha, the Hannon household numbered 11 souls by September 1776, all dependent on the labor and planning of Thomas and the older boys. The farm had grown with the family. Thomas and his sons had cleared 20 acres for crops, had built a barn, had fenced pastures for the cattle and pigs they'd acquired through trade and careful husbandry. They grew corn and wheat, vegetables in a garden that Margaret tended with the help of the girls, tobacco that Thomas traded at the seasonal markets in what passed for towns in this region. They were never comfortable, never secure, but they were surviving, which was all any frontier family could hope for. Their nearest neighbors were the Earl family, Colonel John Earl and his wife Catherine, living 5 miles downriver in a slightly larger homestead that served as an unofficial gathering place for the scattered settlers in the valley. Earl had served in the colonial militia, had fought in the Cherokee War of 1760-1761, knew these mountains and their dangers as well as any white man could. He'd warned Thomas about settling so close to the river, about the vulnerability of being the westernmost family in the valley, about the Cherokee hunting parties that still crossed regularly despite the treaties that supposedly regulated such movements. Thomas had acknowledged the risks but had chosen the land anyway. The river location meant good soil and easy water access. The isolation meant freedom from the judgment and interference of more settled communities. He'd built his cabin with defense in mind, had taught his sons to shoot before they were 10, had maintained a loaded rifle by the door and a pistol in his belt. He'd made his calculations and accepted the consequences, whatever they might be. The Cherokee presence was constant, but usually not hostile. Thomas had encountered hunting parties a dozen times over the years, had traded with them occasionally, had shared game and tobacco in exchanges that followed protocols. Neither side fully understood, but both recognized as necessary. The Cherokee he'd met had been neither friends nor enemies, just other people trying to live in a landscape that belonged fully to neither group. But by 1776, the old protocols were breaking down. The Revolution had militarized the frontier, had turned every Cherokee into a potential British ally, and every settler into a potential target. In July, Cherokee warriors had attacked settlements along the Catawba and Broad Rivers, killing dozens of settlers, burning homesteads, driving survivors eastward in a wave of terror that reminded everyone that this land was still contested, still dangerous, still willing to claim lives without regard for papers or treaties or rights. The American response had been swift and brutal. Militia forces under General Griffith Rutherford had marched into Cherokee territory in August, burning 36 towns, destroying crops, killing anyone who didn't flee fast enough. The campaign had been successful in military terms, had broken Cherokee resistance for the moment, had established American dominance through the only language that seemed to matter on the frontier. Overwhelming force. But breaking resistance didn't end it. The Cherokee who'd survived Rutherford's campaign had scattered into the mountains, had reformed into smaller raiding parties, had begun targeting the isolated homesteads that represented American expansion into their traditional lands. They weren't fighting a conventional war anymore. They were fighting for revenge, for survival, for the principle that some violations couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. The Hannon family became a target not because Thomas had done anything specific to earn Cherokee enmity, but because his homestead represented everything the Cherokee were fighting against. It was the westernmost settlement in the valley, the most visible symbol of American expansion, the easiest target for a raiding party that needed to send a message about the costs of continued encroachment. September 12, 1776. The morning began like every other morning in Thomas Hannon's life. He woke at first light, the internal clock that farming installed in men requiring no external prompting. The cabin was cold despite the embers still glowing in the fireplace, autumn announcing itself in the chill that penetrated the gaps between the logs. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of his family sleeping around him. Margaret's steady breathing beside him, the shuffling and snoring of children packed into the loft above, the infant Elizabeth beginning to stir in her cradle. He rose quietly, not wanting to wake anyone before necessary, and walked to the door. The morning outside was spectacular in the way that mountain mornings are spectacular. Mist rising from the river in ghostly columns, the sun just beginning to paint the eastern ridges with gold, the air so clear and cold that each breath felt like drinking from a spring. A deer grazed in the field beyond the barn, completely unaware of human presence. The valley was peaceful, beautiful, offering no hint of what was coming. Thomas performed his morning routine, checking the livestock, ensuring the fences hadn't been breached during the night, scanning the tree line for anything unusual. Everything seemed normal. The cattle were grazing peacefully, the pigs were rooting in their pen. The chickens were beginning to emerge from the coop, ready for the handful of corn that Martha would scatter later. By the time he returned to the cabin, Margaret had the fire built up and was preparing breakfast. Corn mush, the eternal frontier staple, supplemented this morning with some bacon from a pig they'd slaughtered the previous week. The children were emerging from sleep with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The older boys ready for the day's work, the younger children reluctant to leave the warmth of their blankets, the baby crying with the insistence of a creature who knew no patience. The family ate together as they always did, gathered around the rough table that Thomas had built their first winter. There was little conversation. Frontier families didn't waste breath on small talk when there was work to be done, and only so many hours of daylight to do it in. The older boys, James, 17, Edwin, 15, and John, 9, would work with Thomas today, finishing the harvest of the corn that needed to be cut and stored before the first frost. Martha, 12, would help her mother with the endless domestic tasks that kept a frontier household functioning. Winnie, 7, would watch the younger children, William, 8, Thomas Jr., 6, and Margaret, 4. The baby would be with Margaret, as babies always were, until she was old enough to be more burden than help. After breakfast, the men and older boys prepared for the day's work. Thomas checked his rifle as he always did, ensuring it was loaded and ready. The habit had kept him alive through 10 years of frontier living, and he wasn't about to abandon it now. He hung the weapon by the door, easily accessible but out of the way of children who'd learned young that father's rifle was not to be touched without permission. The morning's work proceeded normally. Thomas and the boys moved into the cornfield, cutting stalks that stood 7 feet tall in some places, the result of a growing season that had been kind despite everything else falling apart around them. Margaret worked in the cabin, baking bread, tending to the endless mending that large families required, nursing the baby when she demanded it. Martha helped and learned, acquiring the skills she'd need when she had her own household to manage. The younger children played under Winnie's supervision, inventing games from sticks and imagination, their voices carrying across the valley in the clear morning air. Around mid-morning, Thomas made a decision that would save 3 lives. The family's ox, a massive beast that provided the heavy labor the farm required, needed to graze in a field closer to the river. Thomas sent John, the 9-year-old, to move the animal, a task the boy had performed dozens of times before. It was routine, unremarkable, the kind of small agricultural chore that filled every day of farm life. John took the ox's lead and began the walk toward the river pasture, the animal following docilely behind him. The boy was singing. Thomas would later learn from survivors some song he'd learned from his mother, his voice high and clear in the morning air. He was halfway to the pasture when the Cherokee appeared. They came from the forest on the western bank of the river, a war party numbering between 20 and 30 warriors painted for battle, carrying rifles and tomahawks and the accumulated rage of a people who'd watched their world burn just weeks earlier. They'd crossed the river before dawn, had been watching the Hannon homestead, had waited for the moment when the family was most dispersed and vulnerable. The first shot killed John instantly. The boy probably never knew what happened, probably never felt the bullet that ended his life at 9 years old. He fell beside the ox, his blood soaking into the same soil his father had worked for a decade. Thomas heard the shot from the cornfield, knew immediately what it meant, began running toward the cabin even as more shots rang out across the valley. He was shouting warnings that came too late, instructions that would never be followed, prayers that would not be answered. The Cherokee war party had split into 2 groups. The larger force moved toward the cabin where Margaret and the children represented soft targets. The smaller group pursued Thomas and the boys in the field, cutting off any escape toward the forest or neighboring homesteads. James, the 17-year-old, tried to fight. He'd grabbed his father's rifle from where it leaned against a fence post, had managed to fire one shot that may or may not have hit anything before a Cherokee warrior closed the distance between them. The tomahawk fell with the finality that characterized all violence on the frontier. James died defending his family, achieving nothing except adding his death to the mourning's toll. Thomas reached the cabin seconds behind the Cherokee. He burst through the door to find chaos. Margaret screaming, children crying, warriors ransacking their few possessions, taking anything that seemed valuable and destroying what didn't. He launched himself at the nearest warrior, a man half his age and twice his speed, managed to land one punch before a tomahawk split his skull. Thomas Hannon died on the floor of the cabin he'd built, surrounded by the family he couldn't protect, his blood mixing with the dirt that would never wash clean. Margaret lasted seconds longer. She'd grabbed a knife from the table, had tried to defend her children with the only weapon available, had died with that knife still clutched in her hand. Her last act on earth was throwing herself between the warriors and the baby's cradle, buying Elizabeth perhaps 3 seconds of life before the tomahawks fell again. The massacre inside the cabin took less than 2 minutes. Martha died trying to shield her younger siblings. Thomas Jr., 6 years old, died crying for his mother. Margaret, 4, died without understanding what was happening or why. The cabin floor became a charnel house, bodies piled on bodies, the domestic space where a family had lived transforming into a memorial to frontier violence. But in the chaos, 3 children escaped. Edwin, the 15-year-old who'd been working with his father, had run not toward the cabin but away from it, had made it to a creek that bordered the property, had found a hollow log he'd discovered during previous explorations, had squeezed his body into a space barely large enough to contain him. He could hear the screams from the cabin, could hear his mother's voice cut short, could hear things that would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his life. But he stayed hidden, stayed silent, stayed alive. Winnie, 7 years old and watching the younger children when the attack began, had shown the presence of mind that sometimes emerges in children during crises. When the shooting started, she'd grab the baby from the cradle and run, not toward the cabin where her parents were dying, but toward the forest where a laurel thicket offered concealment. She'd pushed herself and Elizabeth deep into the dense undergrowth, had covered the baby's mouth when she began to cry, had held perfectly still while warriors searched the area around the cabin. William, 8 years old, had been playing near the barn when the attack began. He'd seen warriors coming and had done what children on the frontier learned to do. He'd hidden. There was a space beneath the barn floor where animals sometimes sheltered, accessible through a gap in the foundation stones. William had squeezed through that gap and had lain in the darkness, listening to his family die, too terrified to move or breathe or do anything except exist in a state of pure animal fear. The Cherokee war party spent perhaps 30 minutes at the Hannon homestead after the killing stopped. They butchered the ox that John had been leading to pasture, roasted meat over fires built from split fence rails, ate their fill of an animal that represented months of the family's labor. They ransacked the cabin, taking tools and clothes and anything else that seemed useful, destroying what they couldn't carry. They scalped the dead, taking trophies that would prove their success to their own people, that would serve as warnings to other settlers about the cost of expansion. Then they set fire to the cabin. The dry wood caught quickly, flames consuming the structure in minutes, smoke rising in a column visible for miles. The warriors danced as the cabin burned, celebrating a victory in a war they were losing, marking another strike against the Americans who'd burned their towns just weeks earlier. By noon, they were gone, disappearing back across the river into the mountains that had sheltered Cherokee people for generations, leaving behind silence and smoke and bodies that would lie undiscovered for hours. Edwin remained in the hollow log for hours after the last sounds of the Cherokee war party faded into the forest. His body was cramped, twisted into a position that sent sharp pains through his back and legs, but he didn't move. Fear kept him frozen, the primal understanding that survival required absolute stillness, absolute silence, absolute submission to circumstances beyond his control. The log was damp inside, smelling of rot and earth and things that had died in darkness. Insects crawled across his skin. Something, a snake perhaps, or a small rodent, shared the space with him, its movements causing Edwin's heart to hammer against his ribs. But the creatures in the log weren't the danger. The danger was outside, might still be outside, could return at any moment. The 15-year-old had seen enough death in his short life to understand what had happened at the cabin. His mother's scream cut short with a finality that required no explanation. His father's shout, followed by sounds that could only mean one thing. His siblings' voices rising in terror and then stopping, one by one, until only silence remained. Edwin knew, even without seeing, that his family was gone. That the cabin he'd been born in, the people he'd shared it with, the life he'd known for 15 years had ended in the space of minutes. The smoke from the burning cabin drifted across the creek, acrid and heavy, carrying smells that Edwin's mind refused to identify, but his body recognized. He'd helped his father butcher hogs, had smelled burning fat and hair when they'd singed bristles off carcasses. What came to him now in the hollow log was similar, but worse, fundamentally wrong in ways that made his stomach heave. He swallowed the bile that rose in his throat, knowing that vomiting would make noise, that noise could mean discovery, that discovery would mean death. Time became meaningless in the darkness. Edwin couldn't see the sun's position, couldn't judge how many hours had passed since the attack began. His mind played tricks on him, stretching minutes into hours, compressing hours into moments. He drifted in and out of something like consciousness, his exhausted mind seeking escape from horror by simply shutting down. But fear kept pulling him back, kept him alert to every sound that penetrated his hiding place. He heard birds returning to the valley, their songs tentative at first, then growing bolder as they reclaimed territory that violence had temporarily cleared. He heard the wind moving through the trees, carrying away the smoke and the smell and the evidence of what had happened. He heard water moving in the creek, indifferent and eternal, flowing as it had flowed before the Hannons arrived, and as it would flow after everyone who remembered them had died. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, Edwin made the decision to emerge. Not because he felt safe, he would never feel safe again, but because remaining in the log had become its own form of death. His muscles had locked into cramped positions. His bladder was screaming for release. His mind was fracturing under the weight of isolation and grief and sensory deprivation. He pushed himself out slowly, expecting at any moment to hear war cries, to feel hands grabbing him, to die as his family had died. But nothing happened. The valley was quiet except for natural sounds. The Cherokee were gone, having accomplished what they'd come to accomplish, having moved on to other targets or back to their own territory beyond the river. Edwin stood on shaking legs, his body protesting every movement after hours of immobility. He relieved himself by the creek, the mundane biological necessity seeming obscene in the context of everything that had happened. Then he turned toward the cabin, toward the column of smoke that still rose from what had been his home. The walk back took longer than it should have. Edwin's legs wouldn't obey him properly, wouldn't maintain a straight line, wouldn't move with anything resembling his normal coordination. He stumbled over roots and rocks that he'd navigated easily 1,000 times before. His vision seemed wrong, too bright and too dark simultaneously, his eyes unable to process the ordinary landscape around him. When he reached the clearing where the cabin had stood, he stopped. The structure was gone, reduced to a smoldering pile of logs and ash that still radiated heat. Smoke rose in lazy spirals, carrying with it the last physical traces of the Hannon family's 10 years of labor. The barn remained standing, but the cabin, the center of their lives, the place where they'd eaten and slept and been a family, was erased. Edwin didn't approach the ruins, couldn't approach them. His mind knew what he'd find if he looked closer, and some instinct for self-preservation kept him at a distance. Instead, he stood at the edge of the clearing, swaying slightly, his body and mind at war over what to do next. A sound from the laurel thicket made him spin around, terror flooding through him again. But it wasn't warriors emerging from the forest. It was Winnie, his 7-year-old sister, stepping into the clearing with baby Elizabeth clutched against her chest. For a moment, neither sibling spoke. They simply stared at each other, two survivors of a catastrophe confirming each other's reality. Then Edwin moved toward them, his legs finding strength they hadn't possessed moments before. Winnie's face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her dress was torn from pushing through underbrush. Her eyes held a knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess, the understanding that the world she'd known that morning no longer existed. But she was holding the baby correctly, supporting Elizabeth's head the way Margaret had taught her, maintaining her grip even though her arms must have been screaming from hours of holding the infant. "Mama?" Winnie asked, her voice small and hopeful, and already knowing the answer. Edwin shook his head. He couldn't speak, couldn't form words that would make any of this real. Instead, he reached out and took the baby from Winnie's arms, feeling Elizabeth's weight settle against him, her warmth reminding him that at least some life had survived the morning's horror. "Papa?" Winnie tried again. Another head shake. Edwin's throat was closing, grief and shock combining to make speech impossible. He looked around the clearing, counting bodies in his mind, trying to inventory what had been lost. Mother, father, James, Martha, Thomas Jr., Margaret, John. 7 dead. He could see some of them from where he stood, shapes that had been people he loved, now reduced to things that needed burying. A rustling from the barn made both children freeze. Edwin's free arm moved to push Winnie behind him, to protect her from whatever new threat was emerging. But it was William who crawled out from beneath the barn, his face pale, his entire body shaking. "They're gone?" William asked, his 8-year-old voice breaking on the words. "They're gone," Edwin confirmed, finally finding his voice. It sounded strange to his own ears, older than it had been that morning, carrying weight it hadn't carried before. William walked toward his older brother and sister, his movements mechanical, his eyes not quite focusing on anything. When he reached them, he simply stopped, standing close but not touching, as if physical contact might shatter whatever fragile control he was maintaining. The 3 children stood together in the clearing, holding the baby who would grow up never knowing the family she'd been born into. Around them, the valley was beautiful in the way that September afternoons in the mountains are beautiful. The light golden and warm, the leaves just beginning to turn, the air carrying hints of the autumn that was coming. The world itself seemed indifferent to their grief, continuing its seasonal progression as if nothing had happened, as if 7 people hadn't been erased from existence that morning. "We can't stay here," Edwin said finally. The words came from some part of him that was still capable of planning, still capable of thinking beyond the immediate horror. "We need to go to Colonel Earl's place." "That's 5 miles," William said, "and it's getting dark." Edwin looked at the sun, now touching the western ridges. William was right. They had perhaps 2 hours of usable light remaining. In normal circumstances, 5 miles was an easy walk. But these weren't normal circumstances. They had a baby to carry. They were traumatized and exhausted. The Cherokee might still be in the area. And the mountain paths were treacherous even in daylight, deadly after dark. "We start now," Edwin decided. "We walk until we can't walk anymore, then we rest. But we can't stay here." Winnie nodded, understanding the logic even if she didn't fully grasp the implications. They needed help, needed adults, needed people who could make sense of what had happened and tell them what to do next. The Earl homestead was the nearest place where such people existed. Before they left, Edwin made one concession to the dead. He walked to the cabin ruins close enough to confirm what he already knew, but far enough to avoid seeing details that would haunt him more than the knowledge itself. 7 bodies lay among the ashes and debris, scalped and mutilated in ways that frontier families understood as the signatures of Cherokee warfare. "I'm sorry," Edwin said to the ruins, to the bodies, to the family that had existed that morning. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you. I'm sorry I hid. I'm sorry." No one answered. The dead couldn't answer, and his living siblings were too young to absolve him of survivor's guilt that would follow him for the rest of his life. They began walking as the sun settled toward the horizon. Edwin carried Elizabeth, the baby surprisingly heavy for her size, her weight growing more pronounced with each step. Winnie walked beside him, her hand gripping his belt, needing the physical connection to confirm she wasn't alone. William ranged ahead slightly, his 8-year-old energy not yet depleted by the day's trauma, his role as scout giving him purpose that kept his mind from dwelling on what he'd witnessed. The path they followed traced the Pacolet River, the same route their father had walked countless times to visit the Earl family, to trade with other settlers, to participate in the social networks that kept frontier families from complete isolation. The trail was well worn but narrow, winding through forests that pressed close on both sides, crossing streams on logs that served as bridges, climbing over ridges that separated one valley from another. They walked in silence for the first hour, each child locked into private thoughts they couldn't or wouldn't share. The baby fussed occasionally, hungry or uncomfortable or simply sensing the distress of the people carrying her. Edwin tried to soothe her with whispered nonsense, words his mother had used, attempting to provide comfort he didn't feel. As darkness began settling into the valleys, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening, they heard sounds in the forest around them. Animals moving through underbrush, birds settling for the night, wind moving through the canopy. Each sound made them freeze, made them listen with desperate intensity, trying to distinguish natural sounds from human threats. "I'm tired," Winnie said finally, her voice small in the growing darkness. "I know," Edwin replied, "but we need to keep going, just a little farther." How much farther? Edwin didn't know. He'd never paid attention to the distance on previous trips, had never needed to measure it, had simply walked with his father until they arrived. Now, trying to judge their progress in failing light, he had no idea if they'd covered 1 mile or 3, if the Earl homestead was an hour away or 3 hours. "Not far," he lied. "We'll be there soon." They walked on as the last light faded from the sky. The moon rose nearly full, providing enough illumination to keep them on the path, but not enough to eliminate the shadows that seemed to hide threats in every direction. Edwin's arms ached from carrying the baby. His legs protested every step. His mind kept showing him images he didn't want to see. His mother's face, his father's voice, his siblings playing that morning, unaware that they had only hours left to live. William stumbled on a root and fell, the sound of his impact loud in the quiet night. He lay there for a moment, and Edwin could hear him crying softly, the controlled sobs of a child trying not to burden others with his pain. "Get up," Edwin said, his voice harsher than he intended. "We have to keep moving." William rose, wiping his face, nodding even though his brother probably couldn't see the gesture in the darkness. They continued, 3 children and a baby, moving through a landscape that had become hostile, seeking help from people who might not be able to provide it. Around what Edwin guessed was midnight, based on the moon's position, they reached a clearing he recognized. The Earl homestead was close, perhaps another mile. Relief flooded through him, giving him strength for the final push. But Winnie couldn't walk anymore. The 7-year-old had been operating on pure determination for hours, but now her body was simply done. She sat down on the trail, her small frame shaking with exhaustion and delayed shock. "I can't," she said. "I'm sorry, Edwin. I can't walk anymore." Edwin looked at his sister, at the baby in his arms, at William swaying with fatigue beside him. He was 15 years old. He'd watched his family die that morning. He'd hidden while they were murdered. He'd emerged to find his world destroyed. And now he had to figure out how to get 3 children to safety with resources that didn't exist. "William," he said, making a decision. "Stay here with Winnie. I'm going to run ahead to Colonel Earl's place and bring back help. Don't move. Don't make noise. Just wait for me." "What if the Cherokee come?" William asked, voicing the fear they all felt. "They won't. They're gone. They got what they wanted." Edwin hoped he was right. "Just stay quiet and wait. I'll be back as soon as I can." He handed the baby to William, who took her awkwardly, unused to holding infants, but understanding the necessity. Then Edwin ran, his exhausted legs finding reserves he didn't know he possessed, his body understanding that this was the final test, that if he failed now, they might all die in this clearing. The mile to the Earl homestead passed in a blur of pain and determination. Edwin fell twice, scraped his hands and knees on rocks he couldn't see, rose and continued without pausing. His lungs burned, his legs screamed. His mind had narrowed to a single point of focus. Reach the Earls, get help, save his siblings. When he finally saw lamplight through the trees, when the Earl cabin emerged from the darkness, like salvation made solid, Edwin nearly collapsed from relief. He stumbled the last 100 yards, reached the door, pounded on it with fists that had lost the ability to feel pain. Colonel John Earl opened the door with a rifle in his hands, ready for whatever threat the night had brought to his threshold. What he found was a 15-year-old boy, bleeding and exhausted, holding himself upright through sheer force of will. "Edwin Hannon?" Earl said, recognizing the boy even in his current state. "What in God's name?" "Cherokee!" Edwin gasped, the single word containing everything. "They came this morning, killed everyone. My brother and sister are back on the trail with the baby. Please, you have to help them." Earl didn't waste time with questions. He called to his sons, grabbed lanterns and weapons, organized a rescue party with the efficiency of a man who'd lived on the frontier, long enough to respond to crises without hesitation. "Take me to them," Earl said to Edwin. Edwin led them back up the trail, moving faster now with armed men around him, with light to see by, with help finally available. They found William and Winnie where he'd left them, both children curled together on the ground, the baby between them, all 3 alive but barely conscious. Catherine Earle, who had followed despite her husband's protests, took the children with the gentle firmness of a woman who'd raised her own family on the frontier and understood both the resilience and fragility of young lives. She wrapped them in blankets, offered water and soft words, began the process of caring for bodies and minds that had been pushed beyond normal limits. The Earle homestead, reached finally in the early hours of September 13th, represented safety of a sort. The three Hannon children, Edwin, William, and Winnie, along with baby Elizabeth, had survived the first 24 hours after their family's destruction. But survival wasn't the same as living, and the journey they'd made through darkness was only the beginning of a longer journey through grief and memory, and the question of what came next. Colonel Earle organized a party to return to the Hannon homestead at first light. He needed to assess the damage, recover the bodies, determine if the Cherokee war party was still in the area. Edwin insisted on coming over Earle's objections, arguing with a stubbornness that reminded the colonel of Thomas Hannon himself. "You don't need to see this again," Earle said. "They're my family." Edwin replied, "I'm going." So Edwin returned with the men, rode in silence as the sun rose over mountains that looked exactly as they'd looked every other morning of his life, arrived at the clearing where his world had ended yesterday. The cabin ruins were cold now, the fire having burned itself out overnight. The bodies remained where they had fallen, already beginning to show the effects of time and scavengers. The Cherokee had taken scalps and some possessions, but they'd left the bodies themselves, displaying the same mixture of respect and contempt that characterized frontier warfare. The men from the Earle place and neighboring homesteads, word had spread overnight, bringing settlers from farms Edwin hadn't known existed, worked silently to collect the remains. They handled the bodies with rough gentleness, wrapping them in blankets and canvas, loading them onto a wagon with care that seemed inadequate, but was the best available option. Edwin watched from a distance, unable to help, unable to look away. He counted bodies as they were loaded. Thomas, Margaret, James, Martha, John, Thomas Jr., Margaret. 7 members of his family, erased in minutes, now reduced to bundles being stacked in a wagon bed. "Where will we bury them?" Edwin asked Colonel Earle. "There's a cemetery near my place," Earle replied. "Your father and I talked about it once. He said if anything happened to him, he'd want to be buried where other Christians were buried, not alone on his own land." Edwin nodded. The detail was specific enough to be believable, but he wondered if Earle was inventing it to provide comfort. Did it matter? His father was dead. Where they put his body seemed less important than the fact that the body existed at all. The burial happened that afternoon, September 13th, 1776. The entire settler community within a day's ride attended, maybe 40 people total gathering at the small cemetery that served the scattered homesteads of the valley. A traveling preacher who happened to be in the area conducted the service, reading from a Bible that had survived the burning of 3 different cabins in 3 different attacks. The preacher spoke about faith in God's plan and finding comfort in the promise of resurrection. His words meant nothing to Edwin, who stood at the graveside with Winnie clutching his hand, and William standing rigid beside him, and baby Elizabeth in Catherine Earle's arms, unaware that she was attending her family's funeral. What Edwin felt wasn't grief, not yet. Grief required acceptance, required the mind to fully process what had happened. What he felt was emptiness, a hollow space where his family had been, a void that stretched in all directions and seemed to have no bottom. The settlers lingered after the burial, speaking in quiet voices about what needed to happen next. The Hannon children couldn't return to their homestead. There was no homestead to return to, just ashes and bad memories. They needed a place to stay, people to care for them, some structure to replace the one that violence had destroyed. Colonel Earle and his wife had already decided. They would take in the Hannon children, all 4 of them, raise them alongside their own family. It was what frontier communities did, had always done, would continue doing as long as violence made orphans. The decision wasn't questioned or debated. It was simply accepted as the necessary response to circumstances no one could control. That evening in the Earle cabin, Edwin lay awake on a pallet on the floor, listening to Winnie's breathing beside him, to William's restless movements, to the sounds of a household settling into sleep around them. His mind wouldn't stop replaying the attack, rewinding and replaying, searching for moments where different choices might have produced different outcomes. If he'd fought instead of running, would it have made a difference? Probably not. He'd have died with his brothers, added his body to the count. But at least he wouldn't carry the guilt of survival, the knowledge that he'd saved himself while his family died. If John hadn't been sent to move the ox, would the Cherokee have waited? Would the attack have happened differently? Would anyone else have survived? The questions were unanswerable, but his mind asked them anyway, torturing itself with counterfactuals that changed nothing. If his father had listened to Colonel Earl's warnings about settling so close to the river, would they all still be alive? Would they have found different land, built a different cabin, lived different lives that didn't end in blood and fire? But Thomas Hannon had been a stubborn man, had believed in his right to claim land and defend it, had made his choices and lived with them until living became impossible. Edwin was his son, carried the same stubborn blood, would spend the rest of his life making his own choices and living with their consequences. In the darkness of the Earl cabin, holding questions that had no answers, Edwin made a silent promise to the family he'd lost. He would survive. He would remember them. He would carry forward whatever remained of the Hannon legacy, would ensure that Thomas and Margaret and James and Martha and John and Thomas Jr. and Margaret hadn't died for nothing, hadn't been simply erased from the world without leaving traces. It was a child's promise, made in grief and shock and incomplete understanding of what such promises required. But it was real as anything in Edwin's life, and it would shape everything that came after. The first weeks at the Earl homestead passed in a fog of grief and adjustment. Edwin, William, and Winnie existed in a state between sleeping and waking, their minds unable to fully process what had happened, their bodies going through motions without conscious thought. They ate when food was placed before them, slept when darkness came, performed small tasks when asked, but participated in none of it with anything resembling genuine engagement. Catherine Earl had raised 6 children of her own, had buried 2 of them to disease and accident, understood grief in the way that frontier women understood grief, as an inevitable companion to life, something to be acknowledged but not indulged, processed through work and time and the relentless demands of survival. She gave the Hannon children space when they needed it, structure when structure seemed helpful, and silent companionship when words would have been useless. Baby Elizabeth thrived in ways that seemed obscene given the circumstances. She was too young to remember her mother's face, too young to understand that the arms holding her now weren't the arms that had brought her into the world. She ate and slept and grew, indifferent to the tragedy that had made her an orphan, her existence a reminder that life continued regardless of loss. Winnie bonded with the baby in ways that worried the adults watching them. The 7-year-old spent hours holding Elizabeth, rocking her, singing to her songs their mother had sung, creating a relationship that seemed more maternal than sisterly. Catherine recognized it as Winnie's way of processing grief, of finding purpose in the wreckage of her family, of keeping some connection to Margaret alive through caring for the child Margaret had given life to. William retreated into silence. The 8-year-old spoke only when necessary, answered questions with single words, moved through his days like a ghost haunting the living. He wouldn't talk about the attack, wouldn't acknowledge what he'd seen or heard or experienced. When Colonel Earl tried to draw him out, tried to help him process the trauma through conversation, William simply looked at him with eyes that had gone flat and empty, then walked away without speaking. Edwin carried the weight differently. At 15, he was old enough to understand the full scope of what had been lost, old enough to feel responsible even though responsibility belonged elsewhere, old enough to begin thinking about futures that no longer included the assumptions he'd built his life around. He'd expected to inherit the Hannon farm eventually, to work the land his ancestors had claimed, to raise his own family in the valley where 7 generations had lived and died. That future was gone now, erased as completely as the cabin that had held it. The frontier had no therapists, no counselors, no mental health professionals who could help children process catastrophic trauma. What it had was work, the endless labor that frontier life demanded, and the frontier philosophy that work healed everything that could be healed and revealed what couldn't. Colonel Earl put Edwin to work almost immediately, assigning him tasks that required focus and physical exertion, keeping his hands busy and his mind occupied. Edwin threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He cleared fields, mended fences, chopped wood, tended animals, performed every task with a ferocity that seemed designed to exhaust body and mind, past the point where thought or feeling was possible. Earl recognized it as another form of grief processing, Let it continue until the boy's hands were bleeding and his body was trembling with fatigue, then gently but firmly insisted he rest. "You can't work yourself to death, son," Earl said one evening, finding Edwin still splitting wood long after sunset. "I know what you're trying to do, but it won't work. The grief doesn't go away because you're too tired to feel it. It just waits until you slow down." Edwin brought the axe down one more time, splitting a log with violence that seemed excessive for the task. "I can't stop," he said, his voice breaking. "If I stop, I see them, I hear them, I see my mother's face. I hear James shouting, I hear—" He couldn't finish, couldn't speak the words that would make the memories more real. Earl took the axe from Edwin's hands, set it aside, sat down on a log, and gestured for the boy to sit beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke, both looking at the stars that emerged as full darkness settled over the valley. "I was at the Cherokee War in '60, Earl said finally. "We burned their towns, killed their people, did things that haunt me still when I let myself remember them. I told myself it was necessary, told myself we were protecting our families, told myself a lot of things that made it easier to sleep at night." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What happened to your family was terrible. It was murder. Plain and simple, and nothing justifies it. But it's also part of something bigger than your family or mine. Part of a war that's been going on since the first settlers crossed the mountains. Part of a conflict that won't end until one people or the other controls this land completely." Edwin turned to look at the colonel. "Are you saying what happened was inevitable? That my family had to die because we chose to settle here?" "I'm saying your family died because we're living in a time and place where violence is the language everyone speaks, where treaties mean nothing and force means everything, where the only thing that protects you is being strong enough or connected enough or lucky enough to survive." Earl's voice carried a weariness that spoke to decades of frontier living. "Your father knew the risks. He chose to settle on the edge of Cherokee territory because the land was available and the price was right. He gambled that he could defend his family if necessary, or that the Cherokee wouldn't bother with an isolated homestead. He lost that gamble. So it's his fault." Edwin's voice rose with anger that had been building for weeks. "No, it's the fault of every person and every government and every decision that brought us to this place, where families like yours become targets in wars they didn't start and can't win." Earl put his hand on Edwin's shoulder. "What I'm telling you is that your father made choices based on the information he had and the world he lived in. He wasn't stupid or careless or wrong. He was just unlucky. And now you and your brother and sister have to live with the consequences of that unluck, and it's not fair and it's not right, but it's real." Edwin sat in silence, processing words that didn't comfort him but that carried a truth he couldn't deny. His father had been a good man, had worked hard, had provided for his family to the best of his ability. But good men died on the frontier just as easily as bad men, and hard work didn't protect anyone from violence that came without warning. "What am I supposed to do now?" Edwin asked, the question containing everything. How do I live with this? How do I move forward? How do I become something other than the boy who hid while his family died? "You survive," Earl said simply. "You take care of your brother and sisters. You grow up. You make a life. And someday, when you're old enough to make your own choices about where to live and how to live, you decide if you want to stay in this country where your family died, or if you want to go somewhere else and try to forget." "I'll never forget," Edwin said with certainty. "No," Earl agreed. "You won't. But you might find a way to live with remembering." The conversation didn't heal Edwin, didn't resolve his grief or guilt or anger, but it gave him something to hold on to, a framework for understanding what had happened that was broader than his own failure to protect his family. He would never stop blaming himself for surviving when they didn't. But he could begin to understand that survival wasn't something to be ashamed of, that hiding had been the rational choice for a 15-year-old boy facing armed warriors. That living meant he could at least ensure his family's story wasn't forgotten entirely. As autumn deepened into winter, the rhythms of frontier life continued with their usual indifference to human suffering. Crops needed harvesting, wood needed cutting, animals needed tending. The Earl household absorbed the Hannon children into its routines, finding places for them in the daily work that sustained everyone. Edwin became Colonel Earl's right hand, working alongside him in ways that would have made his father proud. The colonel recognized in the boy the same stubbornness and capability that Thomas Hannon had possessed, The same refusal to be defeated by circumstances that had allowed the Hannon family to carve a life from wilderness in the first place. William slowly emerged from his silence, though he would never be the cheerful child he'd been before the attack. The 8-year-old remained quiet and watchful, operating with a caution that seemed both protective and limiting. He startled at sudden noises, refused to play in the forest where Cherokee might hide, kept himself always within sight of the cabin where adults could protect him if necessary. Winnie continued her intense bond with baby Elizabeth, practically raising the infant herself under Catherine Earle's supervision. The 7-year-old approached motherhood with a seriousness that was both touching and unsettling, as if by keeping Elizabeth alive and healthy, she could somehow atone for failing to save her other siblings. News of the Hannon Massacre spread through the scattered settler communities of western North Carolina, carried by travelers and traders and the informal networks that kept frontier families connected, despite distance and isolation. The story took on variations as it spread, the number of Cherokee warriors growing in some tellings, the violence becoming more extreme, the details shifting to fit the expectations and fears of each audience. Some settlers used the massacre as justification for pushing Cherokee off the land entirely, arguing that people who would kill entire families, including babies, couldn't be negotiated with or trusted. Others saw it as tragic but inevitable consequence of settling in disputed territory, a reminder that expansion came with costs that someone had to pay. The Cherokee perspective on the attack, if it existed, never reached the settler communities. Whatever motivated the war party that morning, revenge for Rutherford's campaign, defense of traditional hunting grounds, simple opportunity, remained unknown to the people who mourned the Hannons. The warriors who'd killed 7 people and orphaned 4 children disappeared back into the mountains, their identities and fates lost to history. In February 1777, 5 months after the attack, Colonel Earle made a decision that would shape the rest of Edwin's life. The colonel owned land several miles from the Hannon homestead site, a piece of property he'd been holding for future development. He offered it to Edwin with terms that were generous by any standard. Edwin could claim the land as his own, work it as he chose, and pay back the value whenever he was able to, with no interest and no deadline. "Your father would want you to have land," Earle explained. "Would want you to have the chance to build something of your own, to be independent the way he was independent. This isn't charity. You'll work for it, and you'll pay me back eventually. But it's a start, a way forward." Edwin accepted the offer because refusing it would have been both ungrateful and impractical, and because at 15 he was already thinking about futures that extended beyond childhood and dependency. The land Earle offered wasn't as good as the Hannon homestead had been. The soil was rockier, the acreage smaller, the location less protected, but it was his, or could be his if he worked hard enough to make the claim real. He spent the spring and summer of 1777 clearing his new land, building a small cabin, preparing fields for crops that wouldn't come until the following year. William helped when he could, the younger boy finding something like peace in physical labor that didn't require conversation or emotional processing. Winnie visited occasionally, bringing Elizabeth to show Edwin how the baby was growing, maintaining family connections even as their household remained fractured. The work was hard but satisfying in ways that surprised Edwin. Each tree he cut, each stone he moved, each fence post he set represented progress towards something that was his, that violence couldn't easily take away. The cabin he built was small and crude compared to what his father had constructed, but it was shelter. And shelter meant survival, and survival meant victory of a sort. By the autumn of 1777, 1 year after the massacre, Edwin had a functioning homestead. It wasn't much, a single-room cabin, 5 acres cleared for crops, fences around a small pasture, but it was more than many frontier families managed in their first year. He was 16 years old, legally still a minor, but functioning as an independent farmer in a society that judged people by capability rather than age. Colonel Earle helped Edwin acquire livestock, a cow, some pigs, chickens, through a combination of purchase and barter. The animals represented both capital and ongoing labor, creatures that needed daily care but that would provide food, trade goods, and the foundation for building a larger operation eventually. Edwin threw himself into farming, with the same intensity he'd brought to his grief-driven work the previous year. But now the intensity came from purpose rather than avoidance, from building rather than escaping. He was creating something, establishing himself, proving that the Hannon line hadn't ended in that September massacre, that something of his family could survive and even thrive, despite the violence that had tried to erase them. The nightmares continued. Most nights, Edwin woke in his cabin, alone now, having moved out of the Earl household when his own place became habitable, to darkness and silence and memories that wouldn't fade. He heard his mother scream, his brother's voice, the sounds of tomahawks falling. He saw faces he'd never actually seen that morning, his imagination filling in details his eyes had been spared, creating horrors that were probably worse than reality, but that felt completely real in the darkness before dawn. He learned to live with the nightmares the way frontier people learned to live with everything else that couldn't be changed, by accepting them as permanent features of his landscape, by rising and working and continuing regardless of the sleep he'd lost or the demons he'd fought during the night. The nightmares didn't make him weak or broken. They just made him someone who'd seen terrible things and whose mind insisted on reviewing those things regularly, whether he wanted to or not. In the spring of 1778, William came to live with Edwin on the new homestead. The 10-year-old had grown tall and strong in the Earl household, but he'd also grown restless, chafing at the constraints of living in someone else's home, wanting independence or at least proximity to the brother who represented his only remaining connection to their parents. The brothers worked the land together, developing routines and patterns that echoed what they'd learned from their father, but that were also distinctly their own. They were building something different from what Thomas Hannon had built, smaller and more cautious, less confident about claiming space in a landscape that had proven hostile to their family. They talked occasionally about the massacre, usually late at night when darkness made confession easier. William revealed details he'd never shared before, how he'd heard his sisters screaming, how he'd almost left his hiding place to try to help them, how guilt consumed him for choosing safety over action even though action would have been suicide. Edwin shared his own guilt, his own nightmares, his own questions about whether different choices would have produced different outcomes. The conversations didn't resolve anything. Guilt and grief aren't problems that conversation can solve. But they helped both brothers understand they weren't alone in their suffering, that survival didn't mean they'd escaped the massacre, just that they'd been given more time to process its aftermath. Winnie remained with the Earls, still devoted to Elizabeth, still functioning as the baby's primary caregiver, even though Catherine Earl was the official guardian. The arrangement worked because everyone involved recognized Winnie's need to maintain that connection, to preserve some piece of their mother through caring for the child their mother had died protecting. As Elizabeth grew from infant to toddler, she showed no signs of trauma from the morning she'd nearly died. How could she? She had no memory of the attack, no awareness that the family holding her wasn't the family she'd been born into. She called Catherine Earl Mama, and accepted Winnie as a beloved sister rather than recognizing her as something more complicated. A sibling who'd saved her life, who'd carried her through darkness, who'd chosen to sacrifice her own childhood to ensure Elizabeth had one. The question of what to tell Elizabeth about her origins divided the adults responsible for her. Colonel Earl argued for honesty, for telling her the truth about the massacre and her family's fate before she learned it from someone else in a less controlled way. Catherine thought waiting was better, letting Elizabeth develop a stable identity before burdening her with knowledge that might shatter her sense of safety. Edwin, when asked his opinion, sided with honesty. She has a right to know where she came from, he told the Earls. Has a right to know our parents' names, to know she had brothers and sisters who died protecting her, to know the truth even if the truth is terrible. She's just a child, Catherine protested. We were all just children, Edwin replied, his voice carrying an edge that made clear he wasn't arguing, but stating facts. And none of us were protected from the truth. It found us anyway. Better she hears it from people who love her than from a stranger who mentions it casually, assuming she already knows. The decision was made to tell Elizabeth when she turned 5, old enough to understand basic facts, if not their full implications. Edwin wasn't present for that conversation. The Earls handled it privately, in their own home, but Winnie told him about it later. Elizabeth had listened to the story of the massacre with wide eyes and solemn attention, had asked a few questions about her mother and father and siblings, had seemed to accept the information without fully processing its meaning. Then she'd asked if this meant she had to leave the Earl household, if being a Hannon rather than an Earl changed where she belonged. No, Catherine had assured her. You're staying right here with us. Nothing changes except that now you know the truth. But everything changed, of course. Truth always changes things, even when the practical circumstances remain identical. Elizabeth knew now that she was a survivor. That violence had touched her life before she could remember. That the family raising her was connected to her by circumstance rather than blood. The knowledge didn't make her love the Earls less or appreciate their care less, but it created a complexity in her identity that wouldn't have existed if they'd maintained the comforting fiction that she was simply their daughter. By 1780, 4 years after the massacre, the Hannon survivors had established something like stability. Edwin, now 19, had expanded his homestead to include 20 cleared acres, a larger cabin, and livestock sufficient to support himself and William. He was being courted by several families in the area who had daughters of marriageable age, though he showed little interest in any of them. His emotional energy still consumed by work and by managing memories that refused to fade. William, 12, was becoming his own person, developing skills and interests distinct from his older brother. He showed a particular talent for working with animals, could gentle the wildest horse and coax productivity from cattle that other farmers had written off as useless. He remained quiet and cautious, but the paralysis that had characterized his first months after the massacre had lifted, replaced by a careful competence that served him well. Winnie, 11, was still with the Earls, but beginning to think about her own future. She couldn't stay with them forever, couldn't continue raising Elizabeth while neglecting to develop her own life. Colonel Earl had offered her land similar to what he'd given Edwin, a homestead she could claim when she came of age, a future that wasn't entirely dependent on remaining in someone else's household. Elizabeth, 4 years old, was simply a child, energetic and curious and unaware of how unusual her survival had been, how close she'd come to dying with the rest of her birth family. She would grow up knowing her history but not being defined by it, would become someone whose identity wasn't centered on the trauma that had orphaned her. The Cherokee War that had killed the Hannons continued in various forms for another decade, the violence ebbing and flowing based on larger political and military developments beyond the frontier. More families died, more homesteads burned, more children became orphans. The pattern repeated until finally, through a combination of military defeat and negotiated treaties, the Cherokee were pushed westward, their claims to the Carolina Mountains gradually extinguished through mechanisms both legal and violent. Edwin watched it all with mixed feelings. Part of him wanted revenge for what had been done to his family, wanted every Cherokee warrior to pay for the deaths of his parents and siblings. But another part recognized that revenge was pointless, that the warriors who'd attacked his family were probably dead themselves by now, killed in the continuing violence or simply lost to time and distance and the anonymous nature of frontier warfare. What he wanted more than revenge was security, the assurance that what had happened to the Hannons couldn't happen again, that families could settle and farm and live without fear of morning raids that ended in blood and ashes. Whether that security came through Cherokee removal or through genuine peace didn't matter much to him, he just wanted it to end. Part 4 of 4. The years passed with the relentless progression that time imposes on all lives, regardless of the wounds they carry. The frontier that had claimed the Hannon family gradually transformed into something more settled, more secure, though never entirely safe. New families arrived from the east, drawn by cheap land and the promise of independence. Roads improved. Small towns emerged where before there had been only scattered homesteads. The wilderness that had seemed infinite and threatening began to recede, pushed back by axes and plows and the accumulated labor of thousands of settlers who refused to be driven away by violence or hardship. Edwin Hannon came of age in this transforming landscape. By 1785, at 24 years old, he owned a farm that would have made his father proud. 100 acres, half of it cleared and productive, the rest maintained as timber and pasture. A proper 2-room cabin with a stone chimney and real glass windows acquired through trade. Cattle and pigs and horses. Crops that produced surplus for sale at the markets that had emerged in settlements like Rutherfordton and Columbus. He had finally married in 1783, though not to any of the local girls whose families had pursued him. Instead, he'd met Sarah McClure, a distant cousin through his mother's line, at a market day in Rutherfordton. She was 17, daughter of a family that had settled 10 miles to the east, possessed of a practical nature and frontier competence that Edwin recognized and valued more than beauty or social graces. Their courtship had been brief and transactional in the way frontier courtships often were. Edwin needed a wife to help run the expanding farm, to manage the domestic labor that he couldn't handle while working the fields. Sarah needed a husband with land and prospects, a man who could provide security in a world that offered little of it. They'd recognized in each other the qualities that mattered for frontier marriage: capability, endurance, and a shared understanding that survival required partnership more than romance. The marriage produced children with the regularity that characterized frontier families. James in 1784, named for Edwin's brother who died trying to defend their family. Margaret in 1786, named for their mother. Thomas in 1788, named for their father. More children would follow. Edwin and Sarah would eventually raise 12, matching the number Colonel Earl had predicted when Edwin first showed signs of building a substantial homestead. Edwin proved to be a careful father, protective in ways that sometimes verged on oppressive. His children weren't allowed to wander far from the cabin without supervision. They were taught to recognize danger signs, to hide at the first indication of threat, to prioritize survival over bravery. Some of his neighbors thought he was raising his children to be cowards. Edwin didn't care. He was raising them to live, to reach adulthood and have their own families, to not become statistics in a frontier violence ledger that already contained too many names. The nightmares never stopped. 40 years after the massacre, Edwin still woke in darkness to the sounds of his mother screaming, his brother calling for help, tomahawks falling on bodies he'd loved. Age didn't diminish the memories or soften their impact. If anything, they grew sharper with time, his mind preserving them with a clarity that seemed designed to torture him. Sarah learned to recognize the signs. Edwin waking suddenly, his body rigid, his breathing rapid, his eyes wide but unseeing in the darkness. She learned not to try to comfort him with words. Words didn't help, couldn't reach him when he was locked in memories from 1776. Instead, she simply maintained a physical presence, a hand on his arm, a reminder that he was in their cabin in 1820 or 1830 or 1840, not in a hollow log by a creek, watching his world burn. "You were just a boy," she told him once, after a particularly bad night had left him shaking and exhausted. "There was nothing you could have done. You survived, and that's what your parents would have wanted." "I know," Edwin replied, and he did know. Intellectually understood that his 15-year-old self had made the only rational choice available. But knowing didn't stop the guilt, didn't silence the voice in his head that insisted he should have done something, should have been braver, should have died with his family rather than living with their absence. William followed a different path. The younger brother never married, never established his own homestead, instead remaining on Edwin's property and working as his primary hired hand. He was skilled with animals, patient with crops, competent in all the ways frontier farming required, but he seemed to lack the drive to build something of his own, to risk the vulnerability that came with claiming independence. Edwin recognized it as another manifestation of their shared trauma. William had lost his entire family at 8 years old, had hidden beneath a barn while his parents and siblings were murdered, had emerged to find his world destroyed. That experience had left him needing security more than independence, needing the presence of his older brother more than the pride of ownership. They worked together for decades, two middle-aged men who'd been traumatized children, maintaining a partnership built on shared history and mutual understanding. They didn't talk about the massacre often. What was there to say that hadn't already been said 1,000 times? But it remained present between them always, the foundational event that had shaped both their lives. William died in 1842 at 64, his heart giving out while he was working in the fields he'd never technically owned, but had cultivated for 40 years. Edwin found him lying beside a fence he'd been mending, tools still in his hands, his face peaceful in a way it had rarely been in life. The death was quick and relatively merciful, the kind of end that frontier people hoped for, working until the last moment, dying without prolonged suffering or dependency. Edwin buried his brother in the family cemetery he'd established on his property, a piece of land set aside for Hannons and their descendants. William was placed beside the symbolic markers Edwin had erected years earlier for the family members who'd been buried in the mass grave near the Earl homestead. Thomas and Margaret and James and Martha and John and Thomas Jr. and little Margaret, their names carved into stones that would outlast the memories of anyone who'd known them. Winnie's life had taken a different trajectory. She'd remained with the Earl family until she was 16, then had accepted Colonel Earl's offer of land and had established her own homestead. But unlike her brothers who'd thrown themselves into farming, Winnie had struggled with isolation, with the silence of living alone, with nights when memories became overwhelming and there was no one present to anchor her to the present. She'd never married. The reasons were complex and probably unknowable even to Winnie herself. Perhaps the massacre had broken something in her capacity for trust or intimacy. Perhaps devoting her childhood to raising Elizabeth had exhausted whatever maternal instinct she possessed. Perhaps she simply preferred solitude to the vulnerability that marriage required. Whatever the reason, she lived alone on her small homestead, farming enough to survive, trading for what she couldn't produce, existing on the margins of the settler community that had absorbed the Hannon orphans. Edwin visited her regularly, bringing supplies, checking on her welfare, maintaining family connections even when Winnie seemed indifferent to them. He worried about her in ways he didn't worry about William or Elizabeth, sensing a fragility in his sister that the others hadn't developed or had managed to overcome. She died in 1848 at 73, alone in the cabin she'd built decades earlier. Edwin found her several days after her death, alerted by neighbors who'd noticed that her chimney wasn't smoking. She was in her bed, looking peaceful, a letter addressed to Edwin on the table beside her. The letter was brief, written in the careful script their mother had taught her before the world fell apart. Brother, by the time you read this, I'll be with Mama and Papa and the others. I've lived longer than I expected to and seen more than I wanted to. I'm not sad to go. I'm tired, Edwin. So tired of carrying what we've carried, of remembering what we remember, of waking up every day knowing what we know. You did well. You survived and built something and raised a family. You kept the Hannon name alive when it should have died with Papa. I'm proud of you, even though I probably never said so. Tell Elizabeth I loved her, that saving her that morning was the only good thing I did in my whole life, the only thing that made surviving worth it. I'll see you on the other side, brother. Maybe there we can all be children again, before September 1776, before everything changed. Your sister Winnie Edwin read the letter multiple times, sitting in Winnie's cabin, surrounded by the simple possessions she'd accumulated over 73 years of careful living. He understood what she'd been saying, felt the same weariness she'd described, carried the same burden of memory that had finally become too heavy for her to shoulder any longer. He buried Winnie beside William in the family cemetery, another name added to the stones. Another survivor of the 1776 massacre finally laid to rest. 2 of the 4 Hannon children who'd lived past that September morning were now gone. Only Edwin and Elizabeth remained, and Edwin was 77 years old, his body failing in ways that told him his own time was approaching. Elizabeth's life had been the most normal of all the survivors, which made sense given that she'd been too young to remember the massacre. The Earl family had raised her as their own, had given her a childhood relatively free from the trauma that had defined her siblings' lives. She'd married at 19, had moved with her husband to a homestead in the next valley, had raised 7 children who bore no psychological scars from events they'd never experienced. Edwin had maintained contact with Elizabeth throughout their lives, visiting her family regularly, ensuring she knew the truth about her origins, even as the Earls provided her with a stable upbringing. She'd always been grateful to him for not letting her forget, for making sure she understood where she came from even if she couldn't remember the family she'd been born into. Their conversations about the massacre had been infrequent but significant. Elizabeth had asked questions over the years, trying to understand the mother she'd never known, the siblings who'd died protecting her, the father who'd built a homestead that violence had destroyed. Edwin had answered as honestly as he could, sharing memories that were sometimes painful, but that he believed she deserved to have. Do you ever wish you'd died with them? Elizabeth asked him once when they were both old, and the question seemed less shocking than it might have been decades earlier. Edwin had considered the question seriously before answering. Sometimes, he admitted, especially in the early years when the grief was so heavy I couldn't imagine carrying it for a lifetime. But I had William and Winnie and you to take care of. I had work to do. And eventually I had my own family, my own children, who needed me to be alive and functional. So, no, I don't wish I'd died. But I understand why Winnie did, why she was ready to go when her time came. I'm grateful you survived, Elizabeth said. Grateful you kept our family's story alive, that you made sure I knew who I was and where I came from. You were worth saving, Edwin replied. Worth Winnie carrying you through the darkness, worth all of us surviving to make sure you had a chance at a life our other siblings didn't get. Edwin Hannon died on March 17, 1851, at 90 years old. He was working in his garden because of course he was working. Because men like Edwin didn't retire or rest, didn't stop until their bodies simply refused to continue, when his heart gave out. His grandson found him lying among the early spring vegetables, his hands still holding the hoe he'd been using, his face showing no signs of pain or fear, just the quiet acceptance of a man who'd lived longer than he'd expected, and who was finally ready to stop. The funeral was well attended, the community turning out to honor a man who'd been a fixture in the region for 75 years. The preacher spoke about Edwin's resilience, his success in building a substantial farm from nothing, his reputation as a fair neighbor and careful father. He mentioned the massacre only briefly, noting that Edwin had suffered a terrible loss as a young man, but had overcome it to build a productive life. But everyone present knew the real story. Everyone in Polk County understood that Edwin Hannon was the boy who'd hidden in a log while his family was murdered, who'd survived when 7 others hadn't, who'd spent his entire adult life trying to build something that violence couldn't destroy. His survival had been his revenge, his success a monument to the family that had been taken from him. Elizabeth, 75 years old herself and the last surviving member of the Hannon family who'd lived in the cabin on the Pacolet River, stood at Edwin's grave and thought about connections and memory and the strange mathematics of survival. She was alive because Winnie had grabbed her that morning. Winnie had lived because she'd had Elizabeth to care for. Edwin had lived because he'd hidden instead of fighting. William had lived because he'd been away from the cabin when the attack came. 7 had died so 4 could live, and now 3 of those 4 were gone, and soon she would be gone too. And then there would be no one left who had any direct connection to the Hannon family of 1776. But that wasn't quite true, she realized. Edwin's children carried Hannon blood. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren would carry it forward into futures that Thomas and Margaret could never have imagined. The family hadn't been erased by the massacre. It had been transformed, scattered, forced to rebuild from fragments, but it had survived. Violence had tried to end the Hannon line, and violence had failed. Elizabeth died in 1856, the last survivor of the massacre, taking with her whatever infant memories might have existed, whatever unconscious trauma might have remained from being carried through darkness by a 7-year-old sister who'd refused to let her die. She was buried not in the Hannon family cemetery. She'd lived her entire adult life as an Earl, had been raised by that family, identified with them more than with siblings she couldn't remember. But her children marked her grave with both names. Elizabeth Earl, born Elizabeth Hannon, survivor. The massacre itself faded from active memory as the generations passed. Edwin's grandchildren knew the story because he'd told it to them, had insisted they understand what their family had survived. Their children knew it as a story grandparents told, something that had happened long ago to people they'd never met. Their children knew it hardly at all, just a vague awareness that something terrible had happened once, that their ancestors had survived violence on the frontier. By the turn of the 20th century, the Hannon massacre was largely forgotten, outside of a few local history books and genealogical records. The land where the cabin had stood had been reclaimed by forest, the clearing growing over with trees that erased the physical evidence of what had happened. The family cemetery Edwin had established remained, maintained by descendants who still lived in the area, but most of the visitors had no clear understanding of who the earliest names on the stones represented or what they'd endured. The frontier itself had vanished, transformed into something settled and civilized. The violence that had characterized it in the 1770s reduced to stories that seemed almost mythological to people living in the age of trains and telegraphs. The Cherokee had been removed entirely from North Carolina, forced westward on trails that would earn their own terrible names, their absence from the landscape so complete that younger generations struggled to imagine they'd ever been present at all. But the past doesn't disappear just because people stop actively remembering it. The violence of frontier settlement, the displacement, the killings, the massacres on both sides, shaped the land and the people who inhabited it in ways that persisted long after the specific events were forgotten. The Hannon family was one small tragedy in a much larger pattern, 7 deaths among thousands, one family's suffering subsumed into the broader narrative of American expansion. What makes their story worth remembering isn't that it was unique. It wasn't. Massacres like theirs occurred regularly during the frontier period, but that it was so ordinary, so representative of what happened when 2 peoples competed for the same land without any framework for peaceful coexistence. The Cherokee who attacked the Hannon homestead weren't monsters. They were people responding to the destruction of their own towns and families, using the tools available to them to resist what they correctly understood as the elimination of their way of life. The Hannons weren't monsters either. They were people trying to build lives in a place that seemed to offer opportunity, making choices based on incomplete information and circumstances they didn't fully control. Both sides were right, both sides were wrong. And in the collision between them, families like the Hannons were destroyed. Survivors like Edwin and William and Winnie and Elizabeth were created, and the frontier moved forward over their bodies and memories, indifferent to the suffering it caused. Epilogue: The Geography of Memory. Today, tourists visit Polk County, North Carolina, drawn by the beauty of the mountains, the hiking trails that wind through forests, the small towns that market themselves as gateways to Appalachian charm. They stay at bed and breakfasts in historic inns, eat at restaurants that serve food identified as traditional mountain cuisine, buy crafts marketed as authentic representations of regional culture. Very few of them know that they're walking through landscapes soaked in blood, that the peaceful valleys and scenic vistas were once contested ground where families died for the right to claim a few acres of land. The violence that created the settled landscape they're enjoying has been successfully erased from the tourist narrative, replaced with sanitized versions of frontier history that emphasize pioneer resilience without acknowledging the costs that resilience imposed on everyone involved. The site where the Hannon cabin stood is now part of a nature preserve, the land protected from development, allowed to return to something resembling its pre-settlement state. There's no marker indicating what happened there in September 1776. No plaque explaining that 7 people died on that ground. No acknowledgement that the forest visitors hiked through grew over ruins and graves, and memories that no one bothered to preserve. One of the historic inns that tourists stay at, the Mimosa Inn, a beautiful bed and breakfast that offers scenic mountain views and comfortable accommodations, sits on land that may have been visible from the Hannon homestead. Guests sleep peacefully in beds a few miles from where children hid in hollow logs and laurel thickets, where a 7-year-old carried a baby through darkness, where a family was erased in minutes. They wake to enjoy breakfast on a porch overlooking valleys where Cherokee hunting parties once crossed, where settlers built cabins, where violence wrote itself into the landscape in ways that time has rendered invisible. The Hannon descendants still live in the region, though most of them don't know their connection to the 1776 massacre. Family trees branch and diverge, names change through marriage, stories get lost or simplified or forgotten. A few genealogists maintain the records, preserve the connections, ensure that someone still knows who Thomas and Margaret Hannon were, what happened to their family, how Edwin and William and Winnie and Elizabeth survived. In some county historical society archive, gathering dust, there's probably a file on the Hannon massacre, a few pages of notes compiled by some local historian decades ago, recording what could be recovered of the story before the last people who'd heard it directly from survivors died. Names and dates and bare facts, stripped of emotion and context, reduced to data points in a larger narrative about frontier violence and settler-indigenous conflict. But the emotional truth of what happened, the terror of children watching their family die, the guilt of survivors who hid while others fought and lost, the decades of nightmares and grief and trying to build lives from ruins, that truth is harder to preserve. It can't be reduced to dates and names. It can't be captured in historical society files or tourist brochures or even in longer narratives like this one. It existed in the minds and bodies of people who are now dead, in experiences that can't be fully translated to anyone who wasn't there. What we're left with is approximation. Stories based on fragments of evidence, imagination filling gaps in the historical record, attempts to honor the reality of what happened while acknowledging that perfect accuracy is impossible when the witnesses are dead, and the landscape has been transformed, and the world that produced the violence has vanished entirely. The Hannon Massacre matters not because it was the worst thing that happened on the frontier. It wasn't, not by a long measure, but because it was typical. Because understanding this one family's tragedy helps us understand thousands of similar tragedies. Because the specific details of their suffering illuminate the broader patterns of frontier violence that shaped American history. 7 people died on September 12, 1776, in a cabin beside the Pacolet River. 4 children survived. 3 of them spent the rest of their lives carrying memories of that morning, waking from nightmares, trying to build futures from a past that violence had shattered. One of them, too young to remember, lived a relatively normal life. Her survival the only unqualified victory that emerged from the massacre. The land they lived on is still there, still beautiful, still capable of supporting life if worked properly. The river still flows cold and clear, indifferent to what happened on its banks. The mountains still rise against the sky, ancient and permanent, having witnessed violence before the Hannons arrived, and having witnessed violence after they died, maintaining a geological timescale that makes human suffering seem momentary and insignificant. But it wasn't insignificant to the people who suffered it. To Thomas Hannon, dying on the floor of a cabin he'd built, the massacre was everything. The end of his world and his family and his dreams for the future. To Edwin, hiding in a hollow log, the massacre was a wound that never healed, a defining trauma that shaped every day of his 90 years. To Winnie, carrying a baby through darkness, the massacre was the moment when childhood ended and responsibility began, setting her on a path she would walk alone until death finally released her. Their story is one of millions, one small tragedy in the vast catalog of human suffering that history accumulates. But it was their story, their tragedy, their suffering. And now, centuries later, when almost everything that made them individual human beings has been lost to time, we can at least remember that they existed, that they loved their family and lost them, that they survived when survival seemed impossible, that they carried forward into uncertain futures bearing weights they hadn't chosen and couldn't put down. This is not a story with a moral or a lesson. The past can't teach us what to do because the circumstances that produced it don't exist anymore. We're not faced with decisions about settling in Cherokee hunting grounds or defending isolated homesteads from war parties. Our violence takes different forms, emerges from different circumstances, requires different responses. What the past can teach us is that violence has costs that extend far beyond the immediate moment, that trauma can be inherited across generations, that the landscapes we inhabit are built on foundations of suffering we rarely acknowledge. The Hannon family paid for their piece of North Carolina with their lives. The Cherokee paid for their resistance with their displacement and eventual removal. Both peoples lost things they could never recover, suffered injuries that time couldn't heal, became casualties in a conflict where there were no real winners, just survivors carrying different wounds. If you ever find yourself in Polk County, North Carolina, driving through valleys that seem impossibly beautiful, hiking trails that wind through ancient forests, staying in historic inns that market themselves as peaceful retreats from modern stress, take a moment to remember the Hannons. Remember that the peace you're enjoying was purchased with violence. Remember that families died so the land could be settled. Remember that beneath the beauty lies a history of trauma that shaped everyone who lived through it, and that echoes still in ways we rarely recognize. And remember Edwin Hannon, 15 years old, hiding in a hollow log, listening to his family die, surviving to carry their memory forward for 90 years, building a life from ruins, raising children who would raise children, ensuring that something of the family survived even though most of it was lost. His story isn't unique, but it's real. And now, having read it, you know the rest of the story.